Welcome to this journey through one of the most stubbornly maintained vigils ever kept in the Ozark wilderness. In the years when winter isolation meant months without contact, when a woman alone faced dangers that communities could barely manage together, when accepting help was understood to be not weakness, but basic survival sense, there lived a widow who refused every offer of shelter and assistance, who chose to remain alone in her cabin as winter closed the trails and buried the valley, and who demonstrated that determination and self-reliance carried beyond reason become indistinguishable from something darker. A refusal that looked less like strength and more like surrender to whatever the winter had prepared for those who insisted on facing it alone. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between independence and isolation, between choice and trap. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Before we stand outside that cabin door as neighbors plead for admission and are refused, consider what it meant for a woman to live alone on the frontier, and why such solitude was understood to be dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical hardship. Communities survived winter through mutual dependence, sharing resources, checking on neighbors, providing the human contact that prevented the psychological deterioration that isolation could cause. A woman alone was vulnerable, not just to cold or hunger, but to injury with no one to help, to illness with no one to tend her, to the slow erosion of will that happened when months passed without conversation or connection or reminder that the world contained anything beyond the walls of a single cabin and the white silence pressing against them. Women who lost husbands during winter were expected to accept shelter with relatives or neighbors, to join households where their labor would be valued and where their survival would be ensured through community care. Refusing such offers was understood to be not just unwise, but almost incomprehensible. Why would anyone choose isolation when connection was available? Why would anyone insist on facing winter's full severity alone when shared hardship made endurance possible? The choice to refuse help looked less like independence and more like a decision to test whether human will could outlast winter's patience, whether stubbornness could substitute for company, whether one person alone could survive what usually required the support of family and community to endure. Margaret Hayes made that choice in November of 1854, and the winter that followed demonstrated what happens when determination meets conditions that do not recognize determination as relevant, when pride encounters cold that cares nothing for human dignity, and when the decision to remain alone transforms from active choice into passive acceptance of whatever consequences isolation brings, consequences that no one could fully know until spring revealed whether the cabin still sheltered life or whether it had become a tomb for someone who had refused to leave while leaving was still possible. Margaret Hayes was 47 years old in the fall of 1854, widowed for 3 months following her husband John's death from fever in August. They had lived on their homestead in a hollow near the current river for 16 years, had raised 2 children who were now grown and living in settlements to the east, and had established a life that was isolated but functional, difficult but endurable. John's death was unexpected and devastating, but Margaret had survived the immediate crisis of his loss, had managed the burial and the initial grief, and had made it clear to neighbors and to her distant children that she intended to remain on the homestead that she and John had built together. This intention was met with concern and with increasing pressure as autumn progressed toward winter. Neighbors, the nearest family lived approximately 3 miles away through rough terrain, visited regularly, offering to help Margaret relocate to their home or to another household where she would not face winter alone. Her children sent letters urging her to leave the homestead at least temporarily, to stay with them or with relatives until spring made solitary living less dangerous. The minister from the settlement church, 12 miles distant, made a special trip to speak with her, to explain that accepting help was not abandonment of John's memory or of their homestead, but simple recognition that some situations required community support to survive. Margaret refused all offers. Her reasons, as expressed to those who tried to help her, were consistent and seemed logical on the surface. The homestead was her home, contained everything she and John had built together, and leaving it, even temporarily, felt like betrayal of the life they had shared. She had supplies laid in for winter, had firewood gathered, had managed the homestead's maintenance through the autumn, and believed herself capable of enduring winter alone, as she and John had endured 16 previous winters together. She was not a frail woman, not someone who lacked frontier skills or experience, and she resented the implication that she needed supervision or rescue, simply because she was now alone. But beneath these practical justifications, those who spoke with her detected something else, a quality to her refusal that suggested it was not entirely about capability or independence, but about something darker and more final. She spoke about the cabin as if it were a place she was meant to be, about winter as something she was supposed to face, about staying as an obligation rather than a choice. When pressed about what would happen if she became ill or injured, if the supplies ran short, if the isolation became unbearable, she would say that whatever happened would be what was meant to happen, that she was prepared to accept the consequences of staying, and that she would rather face those consequences alone in her own home than flee to safety and live with the knowledge that she had abandoned the place where she and John had spent their years together. This fatalism disturbed those who heard it. It suggested that Margaret was not planning to survive the winter so much as she was planning to endure it, that her refusal to leave was less about confidence in her ability to live through the cold months and more about acceptance that staying might mean dying, but that dying there was preferable to living elsewhere. Several neighbors considered whether they should forcibly relocate her against her will, should physically carry her from the cabin if necessary to ensure her survival. But forcing help on someone who refused it was both practically difficult and morally complex, and ultimately the decision was made to respect her choice while remaining ready to provide assistance if she changed her mind or if circumstances made intervention necessary. The last visitor to Margaret's cabin before winter fully set in was Samuel Morrison, a neighbor who lived 3 miles east and who had helped John with heavy work in previous years. He visited on November 18, 1854, bringing a load of firewood and offering one final time to help Margaret relocate for the winter. She thanked him for the wood, refused the offer of relocation, and told him that she would be fine, that he should not worry about her, and that she would see him in the spring when the trails opened again, and when whatever the winter brought had been endured. Morrison tried to argue with her, to explain that staying alone was not just difficult, but potentially fatal, that winter in the hollows could last 4 or 5 months, that if she became sick or injured, or if her supplies failed, there would be no way to get help until spring. Margaret listened to his concerns and then told him firmly that her decision was made, that she appreciated his care but did not need it, and that she would ask him to respect her choice to remain in her own home, regardless of what risks that choice entailed. Morrison left troubled and frustrated, knowing that he had done what he could, but feeling that he had somehow failed to communicate the seriousness of what Margaret was choosing. He was the last person to see her before winter closed the trails, the last person to speak with her, and the last person who might have convinced her to leave before leaving became impossible. His account of that visit recorded years later, describes a woman who was calm and resolute, who showed no signs of irrationality or despair, but who had made a decision that seemed to be less about living through winter and more about accepting whatever winter chose to bring. Winter came early and hard in 1854. The first substantial snow fell in late November, accumulating to perhaps 18 inches and closing the trails that connected the scattered homesteads in the region. Temperatures dropped well below freezing and remained there, creating conditions where travel was not just difficult, but dangerous. The hollow, where Margaret's cabin sat, was known to be particularly harsh in winter. Cold air settled there, snow accumulated to greater depths than on higher ground, and the isolation that made it peaceful in summer made it potentially deadly in winter, when help could not reach anyone trapped by weather. Through December and into January, neighbors who lived on higher ground and who had better visibility could occasionally see smoke rising from Margaret's chimney, a sign that she was maintaining fire and presumably surviving. But smoke was the only indication of her condition. There was no way to reach the cabin through the deep snow, no way to verify that she was healthy or adequately supplied, no way to offer help, even if help was needed. The community could only watch for the smoke and hope that its continuation meant Margaret was enduring as she had insisted she would. The smoke appeared regularly through December. Neighbors checking with telescopes or from vantage points that allowed views into the hollow could see the thin gray line rising from the chimney each morning and evening, indicating that fires were being maintained and that someone was alive to tend them. This was reassuring, but also created anxiety. The smoke proved Margaret was still functioning in late December, but it provided no information about her actual condition, about whether she was healthy or struggling, adequately fed or rationing dwindling supplies, maintaining morale, or sliding into the despair that isolation could create. January brought even colder temperatures and additional snow. The hollow became even more inaccessible, buried under snow depths estimated at 3 to 4 feet on level ground, with drifts significantly deeper. Smoke continued to appear from Margaret's chimney, but less regularly. Some days it was visible in morning and evening, other days only in evening, and occasionally it was not visible at all, creating concern that something had happened before smoke appeared. Again the following day. The irregular smoke pattern suggested that Margaret was struggling, but surviving, that she was maintaining fire, but perhaps only when absolutely necessary to conserve wood, that she was alive but possibly dealing with resource limitations or with conditions that made tending the fire difficult. Neighbors discussed whether they should attempt to reach her cabin despite the dangerous conditions, whether the irregular smoke was sufficient cause to risk their own lives trying to provide help she had already refused. The consensus was to wait, to watch for smoke, and to prepare to intervene if the smoke stopped entirely for more than 2 or 3 days. By early February, smoke from Margaret's chimney had become sporadic enough to cause serious alarm. Days would pass with no visible smoke. Then smoke would appear for a day or 2 before disappearing again. This pattern suggested someone who was perhaps sick, who was struggling to maintain fire, who might be reaching the limits of her supplies or her strength. The February cold was brutal, temperatures dropping below zero for extended periods, creating conditions where maintaining adequate warmth required constant attention to fire, and where allowing fire to go out for even a day could mean freezing to death. Samuel Morrison, still feeling responsible as the last person to have spoken with Margaret before winter closed in, organized an attempt to reach her cabin in mid-February despite the snow and the cold. He and 2 other men set out with snowshoes and supplies, intending to check on Margaret's condition and to provide assistance whether she wanted it or not. The journey through 3 miles of deep snow and bitter cold took most of a day, exhausting effort that demonstrated why reaching her cabin during winter was so difficult and why Margaret's isolation was so complete. They arrived at the cabin in late afternoon on February 14th, 1854. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Margaret was maintaining fire and was presumably alive. Morrison called out to her, identifying himself and the others, explaining that they had come to check on her and to offer help. There was no response. He called again, more loudly, and after a long pause, Margaret's voice came from inside the cabin, telling them to go away, that she did not need help, that she had asked to be left alone. Morrison tried to reason with her through the closed door, explaining that they were concerned about her welfare, that the irregular smoke had worried them, that they wanted to at least verify that she was healthy and adequately supplied. Margaret refused to open the door, refused to allow them to enter, and insisted repeatedly that she was fine, that they should return home, and that they should not come back. Her voice was weak but clear, suggesting someone who was possibly undernourished or exhausted, but who was conscious and coherent enough to maintain her refusal of assistance. The three men debated whether to force entry, to push past Margaret's objections, and to verify her condition regardless of her wishes. But forcing their way into a woman's home against her explicit refusal felt wrong, felt like a violation that might do more harm than the help they intended to provide. They left supplies on the cabin's small porch, firewood they had brought, some food, blankets, hoping that Margaret would accept these even if she would not accept their presence. Morrison called through the door one final time, telling Margaret that the supplies were there, that she should use them, and that if she needed help, she should hang a white cloth from the window, where it would be visible to anyone watching from higher ground. They returned home troubled and uncertain, having confirmed that Margaret was alive in mid-February, but having failed to verify that she was truly capable of surviving the remainder of winter. The supplies they left were minimal: a few days of firewood, some basics, food items, enough to help but not enough to ensure survival if her own stores had been depleted. All they could do was continue to watch for smoke and hope that Margaret's stubbornness would prove sufficient to carry her through until spring. Smoke appeared irregularly through the remainder of February and into March. Some days it was visible, other days not, creating a pattern that suggested Margaret was alive, but that her situation was precarious. No white cloth appeared in the window. She was either surviving without need of help or had reached a state where she could no longer signal even if she wanted to. The winter began to break in late March. Temperatures rose above freezing during the day, snow began to melt, and trails started to become passable. As soon as travel was reasonably safe, Samuel Morrison returned to Margaret's cabin, arriving on March 28th with supplies and with deep concern about what he would find. The cabin showed no external signs of distress. Smoke was rising from the chimney. The supplies left on the porch in February had been brought inside. They had been used, suggesting Margaret had accepted the help, even if she had refused the helpers. Morrison approached the door and called out. This time, Margaret opened it. She was alive, but profoundly changed. She had lost significant weight. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that was clearly undernourished, and her face showed the effects of months of isolation and hardship. But more disturbing than her physical condition was her manner. She looked at Morrison with an expression that seemed to combine relief at human contact with something else, something that suggested the winter had taken more than weight and strength, that the months alone had cost her in ways that were not immediately visible, but that were nonetheless profound. She allowed Morrison into the cabin, a permission she had refused in February, and he saw the evidence of her winter. The interior was cold despite the fire, suggesting she had been burning minimal wood to conserve supply. Her food stores were nearly exhausted. A few pounds of cornmeal, some dried beans, barely enough to last another week. The cabin was dark, the windows having been covered with blankets for insulation, and the air was stale from months of minimal ventilation. It was the dwelling of someone who had been surviving rather than living, enduring rather than thriving, holding on through will and stubbornness when comfort and health had long since been exhausted. Margaret accepted the supplies Morrison had brought, accepted his help in restoring the cabin to more livable condition, and gradually, over the course of his visit, began to speak about her winter. She described the cold, the isolation, the days that blurred together in unchanging routine of tending fire and rationing food and counting the hours until spring. She spoke about the silence, about how complete it was, about how after weeks without hearing another human voice, her own voice began to sound strange when she spoke aloud. She mentioned the darkness, how the shortened winter days and the covered windows meant living mostly in dimness, even during daytime hours. But she also spoke about something else, something harder to articulate. She described a kind of peace that came with the isolation, a sense that the winter was testing her, and that by enduring alone she was proving something. To herself, to John's memory, to whatever force had taken him from her. She had needed to face the winter alone, she said, had needed to know whether she could survive it, had needed to spend those months in the cabin that she and John had built, and to come through to spring, having endured what many people had told her was impossible for a woman alone. Morrison asked her whether she regretted her decision to stay, whether she would make the same choice if she had it to do again. Margaret was quiet for a long time before answering. She said that she had survived, that she had proven she could endure what others thought would break her. But she also said that the winter had taken something from her that she had not expected to lose, that the isolation had shown her things about herself and about the nature of being alone that she wished she had not learned. She would not specify what she meant, would not elaborate on what the winter had taken beyond weight and strength. But Morrison had the sense that she was describing damage that was psychological or spiritual, rather than merely physical. Margaret survived the spring and summer of 1855, gradually regaining her health and her strength. But those who visited her noted that she had changed in ways that went beyond the expected effects of a hard winter. She was quieter, more withdrawn, less engaged with the community around her. When people spoke to her, she often seemed to be only partially present, as if some part of her attention remained elsewhere, remained in the winter she had endured, or in whatever internal space she had inhabited during those months alone. She remained on the homestead through the following year, but when winter approached in the fall of 1855, she made arrangements to relocate to her daughter's home for the cold months, accepting the offer she had refused the previous year. She told neighbors that she had proven what she needed to prove, that she had no need to endure another winter alone, and that she had learned that there were things about isolation and hardship that could not be unlearned once experienced. Margaret lived another 22 years, dying in 1877 at the age of 70. She never spent another winter alone. She maintained the homestead through spring, summer, and fall. But each winter she relocated to family, acknowledging that the winter of 1854-1855 had shown her the limits of what solitude could teach, and that she had no desire to return to that particular classroom. When asked about that winter in later years, she would say only that she had survived it, that it had been harder than anyone who had not experienced it could understand, and that survival and victory were not the same thing. That you could endure hardship, and emerge alive while still recognizing that the hardship had won, had taken from you things that could not be restored, and had shown you aspects of yourself and of the world that you would have preferred to remain unknown. The cabin where Margaret spent the winter of 1854-1855 stood for many years after her death, gradually deteriorating as empty structures do. It became a landmark of sorts, the place where the widow had refused to leave when winter closed in, the cabin where someone had proven that surviving alone was possible, but also that possibility and wisdom were different categories, that what could be endured was not necessarily what should be endured. The cabin collapsed entirely by the 1890s, and the site where it stood returned to forest, marked only by a depression where the foundation had been, and by the memory of a woman who had chosen isolation over community, hardship over help, and who had survived but had paid prices for that survival that she would spend the rest of her life acknowledging without fully explaining. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark wilderness's most stubbornly maintained vigils, a woman who refused every offer of help and chose to face winter alone, who survived months of isolation and cold and darkness, and who demonstrated that determination carried to its extreme becomes indistinguishable from something darker, that proving you can survive alone does not mean you should try, and that some victories are so costly that they feel less like triumph and more like lessons about the limits of human will when confronted with winter's indifference to our pride. The widow who refused to leave her cabin as winter closed in stands as a reminder that independence and isolation exist on a continuum, that the line between strength and stubbornness can be difficult to see until you have crossed it, and that choosing to endure alone what communities are meant to endure together carries costs that cannot be fully known until spring reveals whether you emerged from winter alive, but also reveals what parts of yourself were lost during the months when cold and silence were your only companions, and when your determination to survive without help became the only thing standing between you and the recognition that help refused is sometimes wisdom denied. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where choice becomes trap and where independence becomes isolation that takes more than it should, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between strength and stubbornness, between endurance and cost. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on whether Margaret was right to stay or should have accepted help, on what the winter might have taken from her that she could not explain, on where the line falls between proving yourself and destroying yourself in the proving. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the help we refuse and the prices we pay for refusing it, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that survival alone is not the same as survival. Well, that what we can endure is not always what we should endure, and that sometimes the greatest strength is in accepting that we need others to survive, not just physically, but in ways that allow us to remain ourselves when winter ends. Until our next journey into territories where winter tests not just bodies but wills, and where isolation reveals things about ourselves we might have preferred to leave undiscovered, pay attention to the help you refuse. Consider the costs of proving you need no one, and remember that somewhere in the Ozark wilderness, a widow once chose to face winter alone in a cabin that she and her husband had built together, chose to refuse every offer of help and assistance, and chose to endure months of cold and silence and darkness that proved she could survive alone, but also proved that surviving alone takes from you things that cannot be restored through warmth or food or the return of spring, leaving you alive but fundamentally altered by the experience of having pushed yourself to limits that perhaps should not have been tested, having proven that you could endure what others said was impossible, while learning in the process that impossible and inadvisable are different categories, and that the winter she survived was one that survived inside her for the rest of her life. A season that never fully ended, a cold that never entirely left, a silence that remained even when surrounded by voices, because some things learned in isolation cannot be unlearned simply by returning to community. And some winters, once endured alone, leave marks that no spring can erase.